Today, the topic is churn, which is, as a salesperson, it's not a term that we typically use. We would use the term, we lost the business or the customer left or other things because we were thinking about these things as individuals. But what attracts me to the concept of churn is when you have a large number of accounts and you can start to think about them and partition them into groups that are useful for decision making. So how do we get into this concept?
The first thing is maybe give a definition of churn, which is simply a customer that's been buying from you isn't buying from you. And it could be because they're no longer buying from anyone. The postdoc left and is now working in the industry. It could be that they've moved to a competitor, or it could be that they've moved to some sort of a supplementary product. The other issue in here is customers, especially when you look at things like customer buying cycles and customer churn, fall into two broad categories. So the technical terms are repertoire buyers and subscription buyers. Now, subscription doesn't have anything to do with paying for it via subscription. This is a sort of an academic term. So a repertoire buyer is someone who's buying the same thing from multiple suppliers all the time. So if you go to your pantry and you open it up, you probably have multiple different brands of breakfast cereal because you're buying some Cheerios and some Corn Flakes and some Rice Krispies. If you look at your car insurance, no one has two separate car insurance policies. You got one. And now at some point in time, you may switch to a different car insurance policy. So within Biotech, you have very similar products. So you have products that are purchased where it doesn't really matter who the supplier is. You're going to buy whatever's the most convenient right now, pipette tips. You have other things like oligos, where there's a tendency to stick with one supplier for a long period of time because you don't want to introduce a new independent variable within whatever experiment that you're running, whatever project you're running. So you stick with one supplier so that you've got some consistency there until something goes wrong and you get pissed off and then you move to another supplier. And so there is some differences between these two. And if you've got a repertoire product, if you're selling pipette tips, your customers are probably buying from multiple other people all the time. Now, so the likelihood that they would completely quit buying from you is much less. But a lot of stuff in biotech looks more like a subscription type. Even, for instance, the example with oligos, no one buys oligos with a subscription. The idea of a subscription type good simply means that you're primarily buying over and over again from a single supplier until at some point in time you switch to another supplier. And so a lot of the churn stuff, you really see these ideas come out of SaaS a lot because, again, generally nobody has two CRMs. They have one. They may change that one next year, but right now they only have one. And so a lot of biotech products look like a subscription type good. And there, when the customer leaves, they're truly and totally gone. And so the question is, how do you measure that? And then what can you do about it? And again, if you look at the SaaS business, there's a lot of stuff around customer success, and you have entire teams that are designed to supposedly eliminate churn. The reality is that your ability to control your customer leaving you is very limited because they're probably leaving you because of some lived experience with the product. And again, I was in the oligo business for a long time. This was very typical. There were days which you woke up and you could not make an oligo to save your life. The chemistry was so on the edge that required a very little thing to go wrong in production. And you went 2 days without making an oligo, but the customers are expecting 24-hour turnaround. Customers get pissed, they leave, they go to another supplier. In the end, the same thing will happen there, and they'll probably eventually come back. But so it's the lived experience of the product that is often driving this. And so one decision point is around, can you make sure that the lived experience of the product is better? And this isn't just the product, because remember, the product is a process. When you order that product, did you send them an invoice that didn't include the agreed upon discounts that the sales team negotiated, which now makes them have to go back and get you to regenerate invoices? You can lose customers for things like that. So there's lots and lots of stuff where you're interacting with the customer around the product that doesn't have anything to do with the product, but will still drive your churn.
Right. Okay. So There's a little bit to unpack there. The salesperson in me flinched when you said we have very little ability to control customer churn, because that's what one reason people hire salespeople, right, is to increase retention. But I want to go back to like categories a bit here. And I think when the whole idea of churn is if you had customers on a contract to buy a million pet tips a year and they dropped the contract the following year, you would know that they left.
Right.
We don't know that they left if there's not such a contract in place. And then even with the example of oligos, where we have something where you're likely to have a high share of wallet as a supplier of oligos, you within a company like Pfizer, or let's choose a more mid-sized one like Alnylam, you might be selling to 3 or 4 different departments in there. And so you might have your target discovery department run a project for a year that uses a bunch of oligos, and then they quit. And then somewhere downstream, somebody that's doing lead optimization decides to buy some. So is it possible to even sort that out within large companies?
Generally, if the company's large enough, multiple departments are going to be almost like completely independent accounts. Your payment may all come through disbursement and procurement, but your contacts and your interactions and the decision makers are quite independent. So years ago, we had the sole contract for supplying molecular probes to Myriad Genetics, but only to their R&D group, not to their production group. Would have been really nice to have had the production contract, but we had the R&D contract. And so there was an entirely separate supplier for full-scale production. And again, it was like a whole separate account with no way for us to penetrate the account. So I think with very large companies, it's really like you've got a collection of completely independent customers, each driven by a set of independent decision makers. And so you're going to churn by department as opposed to churn by company, unless there is some sort of a central procurement initiative that's saying this company is blessed as our sole supplier for X. And that's still is a relatively rare thing, even in big pharma.
Yes. Yes. So there's a few, the reason I brought that up is I think in life sciences, especially on the research side, we think we do a good job of data management, but it's really quite poor. If you look in the average CRM and you expect a representation of reality, it's not always that helpful. We have duplicate accounts in different places, and then we have accounts like Boston Children's Hospital, for example, where there's never a contact or a department on the purchase order. They just receive it based on the purchase order and then distribute it internally. So you never know which department the product is ultimately going to. And so to measure churn requires you have to have good underlying data, or the whole exercise is worthless.
And and I can give you the inverse of that. So a company I ran a few years ago, we did oligosynthesis, gene synthesis, sequencing, and arrays. And each of those production lines use very common components, disposables and consumables. And they were all purchased in bulk, sent into the warehouse, and then each department could individually pull it from the warehouse. And so when things changed in one department, I'm sure that the supplier could see that there were differences in our order rates, but they had absolutely no clue what was going on. So there is a black box there that you get, especially if you're selling into larger accounts, and especially if there's some sort of centralized purchasing. Going back to churn, there's a couple of interesting things to consider. So one is we now have about 65 years worth of very interesting academic research around customer buying rates and customer churn, and the two are closely related. And what that says is that buying frequency follows a negative binomial distribution. So it's a very steep curve. You have some people buy a lot, buy very frequently, and some that buy very infrequently. But it also turns out that the churn rate follows a very closely related distribution. So it follows a Poisson distribution. So churn rate ends up looking just like radioactive decay, in the sense that there is a well-defined customer half-life. So there is a period of time where half of your customers are going to churn. And then that next same block of time, the remaining half of the remaining half will churn. And so it looks just like radioactive decay. But this is based on how long they've been a customer. So the longer you wait, the more likely it is that they'll end up churning. And so one of the things that most companies, I say most, 99.99% of all companies do is they track churn in a way that is completely nonsensical. So what they do is they say, how many customers did we have this month? And then what percentage of those left us this month, churned? And again, some of this is some guessing because you're making some guesses about how long it's been since they've ordered. But at some point you make a decision, this customer is no longer with us. And you've got 1,000 customers and 10 of them churn this month. So you say we had a 1% churn rate. And the problem with that is that if you look at those customers that churn, they are at all points of their life cycle. So you've got some that came in last month and you have some that have been there with you for 5 years. And what you really have to do to be able to see this sort of customer half-life, this Poisson distribution, is you need to be able to do what's called a cohort analysis, meaning that you're tracking not on who churned this month, you're tracking on, of the customers that churned, what was their survival period, meaning how many weeks or months had they been a customer before they churned. And when you do it this way, you're able to actually then see and directly calculate this half-life number. So you'll see that our customers have an average half-life of, say, 12 months, which means of everyone that we get this month, 12 months from now, half of them will be gone. 24 months from now, 75% will be gone. 36 months from now, 12.5% will still be with us. And the number keeps going down. And there's a technical term for this. It's called a memoryless process, meaning that every point in time, the customer doesn't really make the churn decision based on how long they've been with you. That this next period of time, they have an equal probability of churning as they did in the prior period of time. And the reason for this is that the decision to not use you anymore is very independent. There's no macro level, as a rule, there's no macro level event that is going to cause everyone to decide to go get a new supplier tomorrow. So they're making decisions in an information vacuum. Now, there are rare exceptions that can be catastrophic. A recent one is Bud Light, because what you had a global event that drove the entire market, where basically 30% of their customer base decided all at once, we're not going to buy that product anymore. But those are very rare cases. Normally, each individual decision is being made in complete isolation of all the other customers' decision. But the key thing is that you really have to get any kind of meaningful data. You have to track your churn rate over time based on how many periods they've been with you and are continuing to buy. So you're doing it in cohorts of basically when they came on board. And once you start to do that, you get this half-life number. And the half-life number can be useful because typically this number is extremely sticky, meaning that there's damn near nothing you can do over the span of even years and decade or more that will substantially alter the customer half-life. But if you suddenly see an inflection point, it can mean that there's some macro change in the market that, for instance, if labs that were using arrays suddenly did a major shift when NGS came out. And so a new technology supplants or partially supplants an old technology. And so suddenly you have a large migration.
Right.
And so you can start to detect these things quite early if you're doing a cohort-based churn analysis. And then the other thing that you can do is you can then start to split this up by marketing channel and even by sales rep. So is the business that you're getting from Google search ads churning at a higher rate than the business you're getting from LinkedIn ads or from email or from trade shows? And then likewise, there can be sometimes quite a bit of variability between salespeople. So depending on how much independent prospecting a given sales rep does and where they go to find those prospects, and then the things they say to them. Again, so one of the things that's often a problem in companies is that salespeople promise things that can't be delivered. And
that never happens.
And I had a boss that once said, if we could actually deliver all the things that the salespeople are selling, we'd be rich.
Yeah.
But what happens is that early face-to-face experience with the sales rep leaves a fingerprint on that customer that lasts for the entire customer's lifetime. And so if they are already not not feeling like they trust you, then it requires a much lower trigger event to cause them to start looking around and go to another supplier. Where if they have a deep sense of trust, then you can get over even some fairly major hiccups if they are confident that you're going to be able to correct it and keep going.
Yeah. Okay. So when we start breaking these customers into cohorts, how big does each cohort need to be in number of customers to draw meaningful conclusions about what is happening between cohorts, or when we start looking at different causal factors that might affect churn?
Some of this depends on how fast they're buying. If you're in the business of selling NovaSeqs, so that's like selling a new car. You're going to sell one every 5 years.
They don't churn.
They don't churn. They do churn, but
Everyone from Illumina just left the live stream.
they're going to stick with you for years because they've made a heavy investment. Where if you're buying oligos or pipette tips, they can churn in a heartbeat. And they're buying a lot faster. So again, when I was in the oligo business, the average reorder cycle was 5 days. So every lab is just ordering constantly every week. But as a general rule, unless you're selling very high-end equipment that's cost $1 million, usually what I've done in the past is track it on a month-by-month basis. So of everybody that came on board this month, this is month 0. And then we're going to start tracking their survival rate after month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4. And we're doing this for everyone that came in the past. So we're tracking every single customer has a survival number. That is the number of weeks since they came on board. And so that's how you build a cohort. So the cohort is still your entire customer base, but instead of your metric being what month of the year it is right now, your metric is how many weeks have they been with us. For longer purchase cycle products, it can be by quarter or even by year. But that frequency, a month is usually a fairly reasonable number to track. And it's a number that where changes on a month-to-month basis is enough that you can then start to dig in early and see if something is going on. Is there a new competitor? Sometimes you get a major new competitor come in that is spending a lot on sales and marketing and are just sucking people away. Sometimes there's a new technology that's luring people away from an old technology that your product is based on. So there can be a lot of reasons, but the idea is changes in that half-life can give you an early warning sign of when, that something external to the company is starting to go wrong.
Right. So the other utility I think of with churn metrics, because I have this hatred towards collecting information just because we can collect it and it looks nice on a dashboard for somebody. Because at the end of the day, some poor person in marketing or sales, God save them, is going to have to collect this information, and we want to make sure it's used for something. So when I think about churn and retention type data, I think, okay, this is something that's going to be useful for me to know how long do my customers actually last and how much effort should I expend and resources should I expend to acquire customers. If it costs me $10,000 to acquire a customer, my product costs $500 and I keep them for 6 months, it's not worth it. Same thing with retention, right? How much do we want to spend to retain a customer? If a customer's been with us 3 months, does that customer get more retention effort than a customer that's been with us a year? Things like that.
And again, I've looked at and analyzed churn data in biotech companies for more than 20 years now. And one of the things, so I mentioned earlier that churn follows a Poisson distribution with a well-defined customer half-life, but it's what I call a Poisson distribution with end effects. So what typically happens is you have a really falling off the side of a cliff, steep churn rate in the first 30 to 90 days of bringing a new account on board. And because they're still testing you. Now, again, if what you're selling are NovaSeqs, you pretty much have them for the next 5 years, no matter what. But for most products, if they switch once, they can switch again. And so if that first invoice you sent them is screwed up, it's going to leave a bad taste in their mouth. If that first order they put in or that second or third order they put in, they're all delivered late, or you didn't get the order right, or you didn't package it, then all of these things leave an oversized fingerprint on the customer. And so the place to put your effort is during the initial onboarding period. And I'll give you a specific example. So I came in this a number of years ago, came in to do a restructuring and turnaround on a company. and they had a very high churn rate. And they had a high churn rate because every department in the company was crap. That basically accounting, roughly 90% of our first time invoices were incorrect because there was this sort of bonkers discounting policy in sales that didn't get communicated to accounting, that production struggled to make a quality product, that shipping was very haphazard and exactly what they sent to who. And so you basically had every department was a mess, and it was going to take some time to clean that mess up. But one of the things I did was I put together a separate team where I had people from accounting, from shipping, from production, from QC, from customer service. And their job was every new customer that we landed, because it was expensive to get a new customer. Their job was to make sure that everything that customer ordered and everything that happened to that customer in their first month was flawless. So every invoice had, and we actually had a physical checklist that would be printed out, and every invoice had to be reviewed, signed off, and with initials of who did it. And every package before it was sealed had to be reviewed by someone from this team. And every QC trace was reviewed before the product was packaged.
Yeah.
And so the idea was a stopgap, was to basically stop the bleed until we could fix the deeper underlying organizational problems. And it worked quite well. But that's a great place to put your effort, is making sure that everything that new customer experiences in that first 30 to 90 days is flawless.
Right.
Because
So
you're going to build trust over time by doing that.
yeah, so you're blending a couple different ideas together here. So one is the idea of quality management, right? If your quality is poor, and I'm thinking operations and production, then yeah, you're going to have less satisfied customers, and that's a whole nother podcast.
But it can be fixed, but it's going to take time.
Right.
So you don't want that it's going to take time to fix it problem to keep bleeding back onto your customer churn problem.
Yeah. But ironically, I think in most organizations where I've worked, first of all, the smaller organizations don't have a customer success team. It's either the responsibility of the salesperson or the field scientist to deal with that, and it's highly reactive. It's not proactive. In larger companies, they're in life sciences, they're starting to get this concept of customer success. But I find that a lot of times it's just going through the motions rather than really trying to develop a process and measuring outcomes. And in almost all those situations where I've seen customer success teams, they're not a part of the quality management system. They're external to it, right? So they don't have to play by the same rigorous standards that you would have to in manufacturing. And I think if you look at it that way, it's an opportunity that if you identify a place where customer success team can make an impact, then you really have to have a whole separate management effort to make that work. You can't just throw people and a few dollars at it and think it's going to solve itself.
Right. Yeah. And what I've seen both within biotech and larger within B2B, and you especially see this in SaaS companies, is customer success teams are the people with the shovels that come in after something's blown up. And typically by then it's way, way too late. Because again, what happens is that once the customer has experienced the product and the process around getting the product and the process of using the product, that lived experience is going to be the dominant driver of their future behavior. And basically, if marketing comes in or the sales rep comes in and basically tries to gaslight them and tell them that their experience really wasn't as bad as it was, you're just pouring gasoline on the fire. Yeah. Because already there's a trust issue. And then when customer success shows up to fix it, they're often fixing it by basically gaslighting the customer, which means that you've got an even bigger trust issue now.
Right. And the salesperson that they worked with is no longer involved in the process. So all the credibility that salesperson has built up as an individual is no longer present to solve the problem. And at that point, usually the salesperson doesn't have a lot of things that they can actually do to solve it anyway.
Yeah. And another specific example, that same company, one of the things that I did early on was what I saw early on was that the customer support team was a little confrontational, and partly because they were hit with lots and lots of people complaining about bad product. But the other thing was that a lot of the products we were selling, if you didn't use them right, they weren't going to work right. And so some of the stuff was legitimately user error.
Yeah.
And nothing that we did, but a lot of it was stuff that we did. And so they would get really rigorous about trying to prove that it's because you misused the product, which is very unhelpful. And so part of what I did was I had the customer support team retrained around the very first thing you do is to acknowledge the reality of their lived experience. If they had a bad experience with this product, then they had a bad experience. It doesn't matter where it came from. And to be able to empathize with the emotional fallout of that bad experience, because usually it was some poor graduate student whose experiment had completely blown up, and the PI is going to come in and yell at them. So they're having a bad day too. And if you can start by acknowledging the reality of their lived experience and the reality of the emotional blowback from it, and only then get into the technical details. And part of the problem, again, this is a huge problem in biotech, because these support teams are usually people that have scientific background, that are thinking about it like a scientist. They've spent time in the lab. And so they're immediately diving into the technical details. And the technical details are often completely irrelevant to the bigger issue of my PI is about to come in and yell at me.
Yeah. I think a lot of it's in the incentive structure. As customer success is there, are they rated on their ability to make problems go away? And can you make a problem go away by saying the complaint wasn't valid in the first place? That's a pretty easy thing to do. Yeah, that's again, probably a topic for another day.
Matter of fact, I think we could do a whole episode just on how to manage customer support,
or how not to manage it,
or how not to manage customer support in a scientific organization, because the types of people who are in those chairs, their initial instinct is usually completely incorrect.
Bold statement. Good place to leave it.
Until next week.
Thanks, Dale.